Nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. And this is true for any branch of biology that you might be studying, including cellular biology that we will be studying in this class. So it's important for us to have just a little bit of an introduction to what evolution is. So I'll tell you a little story to go with this. In 1830, a man from a wealthy, prominent English family named Charles Darwin finished his medical school. However, he was absolutely sick watching kids get surgery without anesthesia and all the blood and pain. So he did not want to be a doctor. And as he was in this kind of a gap year trying to figure out what he wanted to do, he had an invitation from a wealthy seafaring Englishman to go on an expedition with him. And the reason why he invited Charles was because this man was from the upper class, and during the voyage he would have nobody to eat dinner with if Charles didn't come along. This is just simplifying it a little bit, but basically everybody else on the ship was part of the crew, lower class, and it would be inappropriate to be mingling with them in a personal way. Plus, Charles was very interested in natural history, and he would have a chance to observe and study natural history around the world. So the ship set out on the voyage in 1831. The ship was called HMS Beagle, Her Majesty's Ship Beagle. It was sponsored by the Queen of England to go and study the coastline of South America for all kinds of colonial and imperial purposes. The voyage ended up lasting almost 5 years, and during this time, Darwin would go ashore every place that they docked, and he would collect samples of plants and beetles. He would look at pine cones and nuts and all kinds of specimens, and he would make observations and then meticulously record them in his notebooks. Lots and lots and lots of observations. Some incredibly cool stories and observations were written during this time. But it was almost at the very end of his long voyage when they stopped at a chain of islands off the coast of Ecuador named the Galapagos Islands. And something that Charles Darwin noticed there is that there are a lot of birds on this island, and they look very similar to the kinds of birds that were on the mainland Ecuador. But the birds on these islands were slightly different than those on the mainland, and they also differed between islands and between different places at an island. He noticed that the birds were very well equipped to find food in very specific ways. So there were finches, these birds that mostly lived on the ground and had the kind of beaks and bodies that were good at finding food on the ground. There were birds that lived in certain kinds of trees, and even though they all looked similar, they just had little differences that made them perfect for finding food in the places where they lived. And when Darwin came back to London, he started writing down the summary of his idea. And here is where he makes some statements about evolution. It's important that I note, and that you remember, because it will be on a quiz or a test, that Darwin was not the first person to imply that evolution happens. And evolution, in the most basic terms, is change over time. There were generations of scientists before Charles Darwin who publicly, they published their ideas, stating that living creatures of the past looked different than the living creatures we see now in the same locations. Therefore, a change occurred over time. And the history of this is really interesting, but I'm going to have to make myself cut it short. So change over time, or evolution, was something that was already established between the scientists of the Western world. When he came back and started to put together his notes of observations from his voyage, what he came up with is a mechanism or an explanation for how does that change happen over time. What made it all come together for Darwin, how he was able to come up with this mechanism of natural selection to explain how evolution could be happening, it's a proposed mechanism, is an essay that he read published by Thomas Malthus, who was a priest and an economist. It was a normal combination at the time. And in this essay on the principle of population, Thomas Malthus addresses the huge social problem at the time, which is the problem of poverty. He sees all these people who are stuck in a cycle of poverty and are unable to get out of it. No matter how hard people worked, no matter how much time they put into their farming or their pottery or whatever it is that they did, they seem to be stuck in poverty. How do we get out of it? And what Malthus proposed, so the economist that wrote this essay, what he proposed is that basically people need to have less children. And the reason why he says this is because human ability to produce more food, more sustenance, can only increase in a linear fashion, roughly. So you work for 4 hours and you can produce a certain amount of food. If you work for 8 hours, you can produce twice as much food or whatever product that you're making. However, the human population increases exponentially. So one couple can have 6, 8 children or more, and they did, because there wasn't a good birth control method at the time. And then their children, let's say half of them survive, and there are 4 of them, they can each have 4 surviving children. So in one generation, you can increase a population in an exponential or a logarithmic manner, while the food ability increases in a linear manner, so slower. There are not enough resources for everybody to be well taken care of and to stay alive. Darwin saw a much simpler picture as far as general nature of non-human species go. Here on this graph, you can see the rough increase in food production. That's the linear or the red one. And you can see the increase in the number of individuals of that particular population in the curve in blue or green, the blue one, I think it's blue, right? So Darwin had this aha moment when he realized that if someone's going to have to die, it is on average going to be individuals. And again, Darwin's not thinking humans. Darwin is thinking his birds and all the other creatures that he saw on his travels. The ones who are going to die are the ones who are, for whatever variety of reasons, less fit to live in that particular environment. So if what works for a bird who is born in the Galapagos Islands is to have a big beak, because at that time there are a lot of big seeds or nuts that fall on the ground, and if you have a beak that's able to crack them, or some other body part or ability to crack that seed and get the yummy stuff from inside, you're going to be well fed and you're likely to survive and have lots of babies. And then they all inherit this ability to crack, because they too are likely to be born with the strong wide beak. Okay? So eventually everything came together for Charles, and he had a very impressive, some will say revolutionary hypothesis of a mechanism that explained how evolution or change over time could possibly be occurring. But he was a very non-confrontational man. He didn't want to upset anybody. He was part of a very Christian, noble community, and being a dissenter with crazy ideas was not really celebrated in the general community. And although a lot of his contemporary close scientist friends knew what he had been working on and they encouraged him to publish it, worrying that somebody could beat him to the punch, and they understood how huge of an idea this was, he did not want to publish it. And in fact, he packed away his manuscript and wrote a note on it to his wife saying, "After I die, please publish this for me." However, that's not what happened, and that's because of another man. And the other man was called Alfred Russel Wallace. He was also an Englishman, but not from a rich family. He had to do a lot of random dirty jobs to get by. One of them was digging a lot of canals when he was young with his brother. And as they would dig deeper and deeper, he would find bones and remnants of species that were very unusual and definitely different than the species that were roaming the English countryside at the time. He was smart, and he started putting this information together that change has occurred over long periods of time. There were animals, plants, organisms here that no longer exist. And as he was mulling this over, life was not super kind to him, and he ended up, for work, going to Borneo, remote islands in Southeast Asia, and his job was getting deep into the jungle and catching different beetles and butterflies. Then he would preserve them, so basically dry them out in a way that they would keep their shape, and he would send them to rich English collectors. It was a really hard job. You can imagine that natives did not speak in English. He didn't speak the native tongue very well at the beginning. There were lots of diseases that he was not prepared for. There was no medication for. He was alone most of the time. However, the story goes that he was laying in his hut in the jungle, feverish with malaria, like delirious, on the edge of consciousness. And he remembered this essay that he had recently read by Thomas Malthus about principles of population. And it's like fireworks in his brain. It all came together that, of course, there are a lot more creatures that are born than those who can survive and reproduce themselves. So who lives and who dies if everyone can't live? Oh, it's the ones who are better suited to find food, to hide from predators, that are able to survive and pass on their traits to the next generation. And he must have been very energized by this idea. He recovered from malaria, and he quickly wrote this hypothesis with some of his personal observations from these remote locations, and he sent it to Charles Darwin. Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, they were not exactly friends or colleagues. They were very different social classes. Charles Darwin was already an established, very respected scientist, and Alfred Russel Wallace was like, working these jobs that kind of have to do with science, but not really, because he needed to sustain himself. So he wrote it and asked Charles Darwin, like, can you take a look and let me know if there's any merit to this crazy idea I have that would explain how life could have been changing over time, meaning how evolution could have been happening. And I don't know how many weeks or months it took for that letter to get to Charles Darwin, but when he did, he must have been like, how is it possible that someone had the same idea that I did, came to the same conclusion? He told his close science friends about it, and they said, yeah, we told you that someone's gonna beat you to the punch, but look, this guy's not here, and you are, and we already know that you came up with it first, like years ago, you just haven't published it. So they suggested, the science friends suggested, that Charles and Alfred Russel Wallace be published jointly in a joint paper explaining this mechanism, this possible mechanism for evolution. But they wrote this paper, they put both of the guys' names on it, and it set off a revolution in science. It was huge, and it is still huge to this day. But over the last, I don't know, 20 years, certainly since I've been in college, that people are trying to give him a lot of credit, considering that he was in a less advantageous position in society than Charles Darwin, who could basically like do science for fun all the time and not worry about money or funding or anything. That if it hadn't been for him coming up with the same hypothesis around the same time as Charles, then Darwin would not have even published his ideas. So I want you to know the name of the scientist and to understand that in general, when we recall these grand names of scientists, you know, Newton or Darwin or Einstein, it feels like there are very few people who came up with all the big important ideas. But in reality, there are hundreds of people who worked their asses off their entire life to contribute to these things, but someone was just in the right place at the right time to put it all together, and then they end up with getting like all of the credit. And in this particular case, we're going to fix that. And I want you to remember this name, Alfred Russel Wallace, another Englishman who around the same time, a little bit later, but around the same time, came up with the same explanation of natural selection as Charles Darwin did. And it's not unusual for two separate people who do not communicate among each other to come up with the same very important idea at the same time. Right? That happened with calculus as well. Finally, in 1859, Charles Darwin published a book expanding his jointly published article called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Okay? And the book accomplished two very, very important things that I would like you to note for yourself. It presented evidence that evolution is happening and has been happening. And two, proposed a new mechanism for how this could be happening. And that mechanism is called natural selection. Let's talk more specifically about natural selection. Okay. Natural selection is able to work because of two main observations. First, individuals in a population, they have different inherited characteristics, right? Someone's taller, someone's shorter, someone's wider, someone can digest dairy, someone has a protein that is able to protect them from certain harmful substances in food while others don't. Some people are able to store more nitrogen waste for a longer time than someone else. So we vary, not just characteristics that you can see, but everything about our brain's metabolism and so on. And this is true for every living organism. I'm only using humans as an easily accessible example. And two, a particular population of individuals has more offspring than that environment can support. So not everyone can be alive because there's just too many offspring for how many resources are available. Let's consider rabbits for a minute. We know that rabbits breed, well, like rabbits, and become sexually mature at only 6 months, and they have a gestational period of only 28 days. That means that a sexually mature female can produce a litter of 3, 4, or more rabbits every month. If you had a pair of breeding sexually mature rabbits on your land, in a year, these 2 rabbits would multiply easily to 60, 70, or more rabbits. So what keeps the earth from becoming overrun by rabbits? Natural selection is like the editing mechanism of who ends up surviving long enough to reproduce, have their own babies, and pass on the inherent characteristics that they had onto the next generation. Okay? And over time, this adds up to individuals living in a certain place being very well suited to survive there. Okay. So let's look here at a very primitive example. So here's a population of beetles, and one of their variations is they have different colors, right? Some are darker and some are lighter. And let's say that they're living originally on the ground of some woods, and the ground has various shades of dark and light, and so it doesn't matter what color the beetles are. But far in the distance, there's a volcano that exploded, and a bunch of lava floated and cooled, and now the ground is black rock without trees and bushes to provide shade and hiding places. And beetles that survived somewhere else have now moved into the rock area. And the ones who are really light colored stand out. They contrast in color from the background. And they're easier to spot by the predator, a bird. So the birds end up quickly eating up all the light colored beetles. The only ones that are left are dark colored. So when those dark colored beetles have babies for the next generation, those beetles they have variation as well, but there are more dark colored beetles than there were in the previous generation. And if this same pressure, meaning there's the dark background, and if you don't blend in, you're going to be eaten. If that continues for a long, long time, you're not going to have very many white beetles in that population. So natural selection is an editing mechanism. After many generations, organisms become really well equipped to live in their environment. Just like the seahorses, the cute little pygmy seahorses that are camouflaged against the coral that they live on from my previous video. I'm going to take a little break and check out a really cool video about these pygmy seahorses.
This is a pygmy seahorse. It's one of the smallest species of seahorses in the world, smaller than a paperclip. Camouflage is critical to their survival. It's how they hide from predators. The seahorses are too small and too fragile to make it on their own, so unless they find a place that they fit in perfectly, they'll die. So the pygmy seahorses spend their entire adult lives on a type of coral called a sea fan. Orange pygmy seahorses live on orange sea fans. Purple seahorses live on purple sea fans. But here's the mystery. Do they search for a coral that matches their color? Or do they change their color to match the coral? To explore that question, you have to watch the process unfold, and no one had ever done that until this year. Biologists went to the Philippines and collected a mating pair of orange pygmy seahorses from a sea fan 80 feet below the surface. They rushed them back to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, and there, for the first time in an aquarium, the pygmy seahorses survived. The scientists watched the male and female seahorses performing their daily courtship dance. They saw baby seahorses pop out of their father's brood pouch. The babies all started out a dull brown color, so scientists wanted to know what would happen if they provided a purple sea fan to the offspring of orange seahorses. And they got their answer. The babies turned purple. They grew calcified bumps called tubercles to match the coral's texture. And there they stayed. We humans tend to think of who we are as mostly fixed. But in the ocean, identity can be a fluid and mysterious thing.
Adapting to a particular environment is an ongoing process, and the different species of all kinds on Earth are continuing to adapt because change is always happening. Sometimes it's happening faster, like asteroids hitting. Sometimes it's happening slower. In fact, there are some organisms on Earth that seemingly remained unchanged over millions of years, whereas other organisms change much faster. It's an ongoing process that happens in different paces in different places. However, all the diversity that we see in the world today amongst living organisms has come about through mechanisms of evolution. We talked only about one of them, and that is natural selection, and it's a very important mechanism of evolution, but there are others. And in order for that to happen, there has to be diversity. So if all of the birds that are finches were exactly clones of each other, then there would be nothing to work with, right? So diversity is really, really important for health of a population. And all of the different species alive today can be organized into different categories by scientists in order to study them better. The broadest category is called domains. So all life on Earth is organized into 3 domains. First domain is bacteria, and bacteria is a domain that is made up of single-celled organisms, and their cellular type is prokaryotic. We will talk about the meaning of that later. The second domain is called archaea. They are made up of only single-celled organisms that have a cellular type prokaryotic. It sounds like the 2 domains are the same, but they do have some differences that we will get into a little bit later. If you want to know more, however, you should take a microbiology class, because that's where all of this is talked in depth about. And the third domain of life is eukarya, and eukarya is made up of both single-celled and multi-celled organisms, but all of the cells in this domain are eukaryotic, right? We will talk about what that means a little bit later. So there are 3 domains of life. All organisms fall into one of these. Here are some examples of these organisms. Almost everything that you're familiar with is going to be in the domain eukarya, the one that has both single and multi-celled organisms. The domain eukarya is also divided into kingdoms of life, and this used to be a big thing that science classes taught. There's plantae, plants, there's fungi, and there are animals, and there are protists. But if you want to know more about this, then take my Principles of Biology class, and we really go into depth. All organisms descended from probably a single living organism about 3.5 billion years ago. And as far as we know, because science is always fine-tuning its ideas, as far as we know, the process that led to such a big diversity of life that we see today It's all mechanisms of evolution. All living things today use a molecule called DNA to store information about that organism in each cell. This is something we talk about a lot more later in this course. But the fact that every single living thing in the world uses DNA as a code supports the theory that all life came from a single source. All living systems are open systems. We're continually taking in energy from the outside in order to maintain life. We are self-organizing. We, as in living organisms, are self-organizing at different levels. And as we talked about, various different levels of organization, from just atoms to molecules to cells, have different characteristics. So there are a few unifying themes in biology that we've discussed in this chapter, and we will continue to bring them up as a side aspect of many future lectures. So all living things are made out of cells. This is part of what is called the cell theory of life, and all living cells come from other living cells. So you cannot just take a combination of all the necessary atoms and molecules and combine them together and create a cell. All life, as we know it, uses the molecule DNA as a code for information that ends up getting passed from cell to cell and from one generation of that living organism to the next. This third theme was exemplified by our Galapagos finch situation, and that is structure is related to function. And in basic terms, it is that the physical shape of something is directly related to the function of that thing. So whether we're talking about a bird's beak is structured a certain way so that it can do certain functions, or even if we're talking about the shape of a molecule that is interacting with other molecules in a certain way, in biology, structure and function are very closely linked, and this will continue to be a theme of this class. And finally, evolution explains diversity of all life on Earth. Remember that evolution is just change over time, and there are several mechanisms for how this change happens, one of which is called natural selection that we discussed in this chapter. And that is the introduction to the remainder of this course.